I will tell you what I have done in this range of model-based and data-driven imaging. What I got interested in about 5 years ago is to try to bring those two worlds a bit closer together. And so all of this started in a collaboration with a very good colleague of mine, Juan Carlos de los Reyes from the University of Quito. And it all started with him giving a seminar talk in Cambridge, speaking about a PD-constrained optimization problem that he was working on. First of all, the framework that I will be in this presentation most of the time is the framework of variational regularization methods. And the kind of parts of the model that I would like the data to drive eventually is the regularization part. So this is what I will focus on in this presentation. And in order to do that, I will first set the scene and tell you what variational regularization methods are and tell you why modeling of regularization is cool, but also why it's hard, by talking you a little bit through a few examples, few applications that I've been working on over the last couple of years. So here I will be brief. I will kind of skim over these applications, not go into much detail about what is behind them. Okay. So most of you are probably familiar with variational regularization. Actually, let me just really, I think that the microphone depends where I'm looking at.
It's working well.
Yeah, really? Okay. Okay. Okay, okay. Okay, so, okay, variational regularization. So the very generic idea is that I want to solve an equation like this. I'm measuring datum G, but I'm not directly interested in G, and I want to extract from G a function U that in most of the things that I'm going to show you is an image. And what I know about G and U is how they are connected to each other, namely via this forward model, where, again, in most of the cases that I'm going to show you, this forward model is a linear operator. And then I have some disturbance, some random disturbance in the data that I just call noise here. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so one way of solving this, usually very ill-posed problem, is to phrase it or to look for an approximation of the solution as a minimizer of a functional, which is now my variational regularization model, which consists usually of two terms. One of them encapsulates the forward model, this equation that I have here, quantifying the difference between the forward model and the datum in some distance function. Think about a squared, least squares fit or something like that. And the other one is to complement this data fidelity term with a regularization that now, hopefully, if I choose it right, turns this ill-posed problem into a well-posed problem, which encodes some prior information I have about the type of solution that I would like to compute, and mostly in terms of some regularity assumption that I have on U. And then I have a weight between the two, this alpha, which tells me how much do I need to regularize and how much can I trust into this fidelity term. So before I go to one particular choice of variational regularization, let me also motivate why we might want to use such a thing. So one of the kind of engineering type solutions that is quite widely used and actually also mostly used in a clinical setting is the so-called zero filling solution, which just does the following thing. You just say, okay, I don't know all the Fourier coefficients of U, and this is one example of a sampling pattern in Fourier space. The white areas are the ones where I know the Fourier coefficients. Okay, I don't know all of them. So I just set all the ones that I don't know to 0. Then I have all the Fourier coefficients. And I invert the Fourier transform. And this is an image that you get from something like that. Okay? I'll show you the ground truth in a second. This is simulated, so I know what I should get, and maybe most of you have seen this before as well. Okay, so this kind of motivates that you might want to do a little bit better. Also, filling this with wrong information seems a bit weird. So why not fill it with maybe the right information, if you can somehow guess what the right information is, encapsulated in a prior assumption I have about you. And so one very popular choice in terms of a regularization encoding such a prior assumption is total variation regularization, where the main thing, and it's very popular in image processing, the main thing that you kind of feed the model with is to say, I assume that the most important structures in the image that I would like to look at are in the jump set, are in the jump discontinuities, and everywhere else nothing much is happening. And so you can also phrase this by saying, if I take the gradient of the image, the gradient is sparse, which means my image is well approximated by something piecewise constant. And so this is the type of solution that you get in this case. And just to say, in this case, this is the ground truth, the so-called Shep-Logan phantom, and it seems like a good assumption to take. Okay. Now, just because I will show you also a few PDE-type image processing models later on, let me make this connection here, and this might also remind you of some things that Andrea talked about yesterday. If we simplify our inverse problem to denoising, so the forward operator T is just the identity, and I still look at total variation regularization, I can write down a steepest descent for this energy minimization, which is given here in terms of the subdifferential inclusion. And if I pick one particular subgradient of the total variation here, which is this one, then you see that this regularization process is actually a nonlinear diffusion that is smoothing the image, where you see exactly this role of the size of the gradient of u. When the gradient of u is large, you diffuse less, so you keep the edges, and when the gradient of u is small, you diffuse more. Okay, so people, and rightly so, are very much criticized for using the Shep-Logan phantom because it's too simple. But I've used it to make this point about the piecewise constant assumption. Let me show you that this actually really works in practice as well. So this is an example where some colleagues of us in chemical engineering have done an experiment where they have a tube filled with water, and then they have an inner tube which they inject a tracer in, which is this yellowish stuff here. And then with magnetic resonance tomography, they are visualizing, they're acquiring the dynamics over time. And so this is a 4D example. So here on the left, you see the reconstruction. You see one time snapshot of the solution of this tube in 3D rotating. And here on the right, you see one 2D slice through the time evolution of how this tracer is propagating into the tube. And this is solved via such a total variation regularization approach. Now total variation regularization in all 4 dimensions. Okay, that seems to work well. Let me just show you again for comparison. This is the zero filling solution. And you really can't see anything. So variation regularization really pays off. Okay. Now let's forget about the dynamics for a second and go back to the task of image denoising. Now let's deviate a little bit from looking only at images which are already piecewise constant, like the Shep-Logan phantom. And let's look at an image which is still quite simple, but which now also has parts which are where the intensity is linearly decreasing or increasing. Okay, so if in this case you are denoising this image with the total variation and an L2 fidelity term. And I don't know how well you can see this on the projector, but you're doing well to preserve the discontinuities. The piecewise constant parts are well reconstructed. But in the parts where this piecewise constant assumption is violated, you see these blocky, nasty artifacts. I don't know if you can see them. Can you see them? Yeah? Okay. So this is also called the staircasing effect. This is a very well-known artifact of this combination between total variation and L2. Thank you. Okay. So now you think, well, maybe we shouldn't look for sparsity in the gradient, but maybe sparsity in the Hessian, because I want to reconstruct these piecewise linear things. And if you do this, then you get an image like this, but then you are smoothing the edges because you have this, you have too much regularity. Or you try to do something of both, and this is what is called total generalized variation regularization, which is a type of infimal convolution between first order and second order total variation regularization, in the sense that this regularization, of course, with an appropriate choice of these parameters alpha 1 and alpha 2, is by itself choosing the right type of regularization in different areas of the image. So where first order total variation regularization is more appropriate, the first order term will be stronger, and in the other region, the other way around. Okay, so that's good. Now, what if I now tell you maybe sparsity is also not the only thing that you could do as a regularization? Maybe in some scenarios, now going back to a dynamic setting, you might have more information about the type of dynamics that are involved in your application. So why not, if you have that, also involve a dynamic model? Like in this case here, we are reconstructing a U that is now in 3D, so two-dimensional space and time, with a forward operator now that is a projection onto, that is also changing over time onto a subset of the pixels in the image. You add some noise, and this is the data F. So this is my data F here. And now I'm reconstructing U by not just imposing maybe here some sparsity in this regularization, but also by imposing that there is some dynamics going on that are either in this case this is a mass preserving model, which means that the overall, so the integral over the intensity is preserved over time, or you assume that this is the brightness constancy assumption or optical flow constraint, that when your object moves, the brightness doesn't change locally. Okay, and then you can get something like this, which is also nice. Okay. So now, why I'm doing this is just to tell you that there is such a big variety of models that you could use. And a lot of effort in the applied analysis community and in the image processing community has gone over the last, I don't know, 30, 40 years really into what are the good models and what can we say about solutions to these models. Now let's change the task. Image reconstruction is not the only task. And this is again connected to the talk of Andrea from yesterday. This is a segmentation problem. So here I have a bunch of cells. And first of all, I'm only interested in cells which are going through mitosis, through cell division. So this is already one task that I have to solve, to only detect those. But then what I want to do with those cells is I want to track them through the mitosis, from the beginning of the mitotic process to the end. And so this is a segmentation problem, where you see these blue or cyan guys here are the segmentation. And so here now my energy that I use to find the boundaries around the cells, they now encode properties of where the boundary should be. Like what we've seen in Andrea's talk, where the edges are strong, or this idea of that the segmentation of inside and outside of the object can be well approximated by something piecewise constant again. Okay, and this seems quite involved. Now the reason why you have this huge amount of terms here is that the unfortunate thing with these cells is that they change their properties, their characteristics during the mitotic process. So they can have very, very sharp edges at some point, but in other parts of the mitotic process, they kind of have this very fractal kind of nature of the boundary. Okay, anyway, so, and then, you know, you can use a very similar idea of looking for sharp edges on a completely different type of imaging data, not phrasing the segmentation as in this case, living on a two-dimensional physical plane, but here in a feature space, and then choosing the right features, you can pull this idea of looking for strong gradients onto a task where you want to segment trees out of multiple types of imaging data that you have collected on an airplane. So now we go from cells to imaging to trees, and we can use very similar principles. Or you can use it for segmenting these blazes on the forehead of these pied flycatcher birds. Where in this case, the application was actually quite nice. It's a collaboration with a zoologist, where she came with us. She came to us with the hypothesis that the size of the blaze on the forehead of these pied flycatcher birds has something to do with their sexual attractiveness or with their reproduction frequency. Okay, so I'll finish off in a moment with this. Let me just tell you one more thing, which is something that is very close to my heart because I did that during my PhD. This is image inpainting. And now for image inpainting, so before we saw sparsity for reconstruction might be a good idea. We have seen that looking for sharp edges might be also a good idea for segmentation. So now for inpainting, which is an interpolation problem, you might be looking for other mechanisms to solve this. So inpainting is the task when you have a domain in an image, like in this case, Joanna, who is a PhD student of mine, or who was a PhD student of mine, was sitting on a stool. And so what you want to do is you want to take the stool and you want to replace it by something that is suggested by the boundary of the stool. So this is an interpolation problem where you interpolate the colors on the boundary of the stool across the domain of the stool. So you want to propagate some information from the surrounding into the area of the stool. And so in this case, we use this equation to produce this result. And this might seem familiar. We had this before. So one idea is you want to propagate structure into the whole, but somehow you want to also preserve edges when you do this. And why we were not satisfied only with the second order PDE, but we went to a fourth order PDE, was just because we got one more boundary condition. So not just feeding this equation that we now solve on the region of the stool with the intensity information of the intact part of the image, but also with directional information in terms of the gradient. And so this gives this result, where still, this is not perfect. If you look here, although we did, we really tried very hard thinking about this PDE to propagate edges into this, into the domain of the stool, you can still see this is a diffusion equation. So it will still diffuse a little bit the structure that you wanted actually to be preserved. You could do transport. So there are also transport-based inpainting approaches. I'm not showing this here, but the whole point of all of this is that modeling is quite hard, in fact. And so sticking to the inpainting example, what is hard is to understand, first of all, what do I want as a result? And second, how do I formalize this into a mathematical model that then gives me this result. And I don't know how many of you know this story behind this image. So this was this, for those of you who don't know, this was this Spanish lady a couple of years ago who was a frequent visitor of a church there, and there was a Jesus painting in this church, and she really couldn't look anymore at this painting because it was very, very damaged, and so she restored it. That's the result. It's an in-painting result, and that was how it looked before. So, I mean, who tells you that this isn't, I mean, yeah. So how to evaluate this? It's really hard. And so one of my former PhD students, Rob Hawking, he then took from the internet the picture of how it looked before, and he used the variational in-painting approach to produce this rather than this. So you can choose which one you like more. But anyway. And so modeling is so hard, and the model changes from one application to another application, from one task that we want to solve to another task. So why not forget all about modeling and just throw a richly parametrized neural network onto my problem, lots of data that I have, lots of examples of solutions that I want to get, and just let this network decide what are the good driving factors and in order to solve my imaging problem. Okay, so what we were interested in, as I said, was to find a bit of a middle way. And so I will start with a very, very low parameterization, extremely simple type of learning approach, which is a bi-level optimization approach, which has the following idea. You have your variational regularization model. You parameterize it with a parameter vector lambda. And then what you want to do is you want to optimize over these parameters lambda such that solutions of your variational model are close in some sense, and this is encoded here in this loss function, to some desirable examples you have in a training set. Okay? This is the idea. Okay. So this is joint work with a couple of people. I mentioned Juan Carlos, Martin Benning, who is in Cambridge, Matthias Erhard in Cambridge, Tuomo Valkonen, who is in Liverpool, Ferdia, who is a PhD student of mine, and Luca Calatroni, who is in Paris at École Polytechnique. Okay, so very conceptually, the idea is actually already, as I said at the beginning, but what could these parameters lambda be that you want to learn? And so conceptually here, you see, I start out with such a variational regularization approach. I have this generic structure of having a regularization and having a data fitting term. And so the parameters that you might be unsure about could be the type of regularization that you should choose, the type of quantification you should choose for fitting your forward model to the data, how much you should regularize, and maybe even how exactly you should acquire the data in order to get the best results back. So I'm not going to do this. This is just conceptually what you might imagine you do. And you want to choose them optimally such that if you start with a training set of typical measurements that you take and corresponding ground truth, or at least some approximation, close enough approximation of the ground truth that you desire to achieve this, you want to optimize for those. And you want to find one model that is good for all of those guys. Okay, so a couple of people have looked at this problem. By the way, this is called bi-level optimization problem because you have an optimization problem on two levels. This is your lower level problem, your constraint, and the upper level problem. And so a couple of people have looked at this, so maybe just to start out with, this idea is actually already quite old, and people in optimal design, which is related, for instance, to this idea of optimizing how you best acquire the data, have done this for more than 15 years or so. And then I would say from a regularization perspective, we have started with that in 2013, as well as the group of Tom Pock, and I will show you one example of the kind of things that he is doing in a few minutes. And then a few other people also did some very interesting work. Michael Hintermüller looked at this, as well as Irene Fonseca, who, as you can imagine, did some really difficult analysis on the problem. What I will show you, the work that we did with Juan Carlos, is very much based on the idea that we first optimize and then discretize. And really the main reason is because first of all, I can understand continuum models much better than discrete ones. And you aim to derive resolution-independent optimization methods to solve this bi-level optimization problem. Yeah, so let me show you what I'm solving. And this seems a bit more complicated now, but it's much simpler. And this is where I said this is a very simple parametrization that I can still kind of understand what the regularization term is all about. So this is my energy that I've now parametrized in terms of these alpha j's and lambda i's. I will only show you, and that's why I'm not going into detail, I will only show you the effect of optimizing over this term here, and only show you the scenario when the alpha j's are not spatially dependent. We have done some work also on choosing different discrepancy terms, but I'm not going to show you that because I'm anyway running out of time. Okay, so here the idea is I set up this regularization term as a linear combination of different total variation type regularization terms. And the AJs are not the ones that I learned. The AJs are the ones that I'm feeding this regularizer with. And then I have a certain number of them, and I learn which one of them are important in this, and how I should weight them against each other to solve this problem in an optimal way. And how do I evaluate the result? So as I said, I evaluate the solution of this variational problem by comparing it with some desirable example that I have in my training set that corresponds to the datum fk. And I'm going to show you two different types of optimality criterion. One of them is just the least squares fit, which in terms of, because my solution will mostly be images, is optimizing for a regularization that gives you the best result in terms of the signal-to-noise ratio. And I'm going to show you one where I'm, instead of comparing the image functions directly, I'm going to compare their gradients. Okay, and I'm going to compare their gradients in a smoothed L1 type norm. Okay. So I will not go there, but I'm very happy to explain all of what we can do here analytically. So one really of the main driving factors of why we focused on this type of parametrization is that, first of all, these are the type of regularizers that people are using in practice. But also, we didn't want to parameterize completely because then we can't prove anything. So what we can prove in this setting, and now just to show you what the challenges are here. First of all, because we have this total variation type regularization, this is an optimization problem in Banach space. Second of all, and it's a non-reflexive Banach space as well. So you have a very weak topology. And second of all, these regularizers are non-differentiable. And so this poses significant problems in how you can prove existence. Existence you can still prove of these parameters, but in particular, how to derive an optimality system. And remember, I want to derive an optimality system because I want to optimize and then discretize and then solve the problem, right? Okay, so we can do that. And the only thing I want to say here is that this is based on something that Juan Carlos did in a paper before we met. This was the one that he talked about actually in Cambridge, which is an active-inactive set smoothing strategy. So he smoothes the lower level problem, then he derives an optimality system, and then he lets the smoothing parameter go to 0 and get the corresponding optimality system as well for the non-smooth problem. Okay, so let me just quickly go over this. Okay. And the nice thing is, because I have now this optimality system, I can throw this into the numerics. And in order to solve this, so going back to your question before, how I'm solving this is via a quasi-Newton method, where for the state equation, I'm using, depending on what exactly what type of AJs I'm putting in here, I'm using a semi-smooth Newton approach to solve this. And for the adjoint equation, I can just read this off from the optimality system. I can just use this and feed that into the gradient of the cost functional. And what else is important to say? Maybe just to say that if you have, the larger your training set gets, the more constraints, you have, and the harder it gets to solve. And here we're just adapting something that Bird et al. Did, which is a dynamic sampling approach, where we don't solve for all the constraints at the same time. Yeah. And it's already non-convex for a very simple problem, where I just have one parameter. I just have one parameter. I've looked at the total variation regularization approach for denoising. And the only thing I want to learn is the weight in front of this regularization term, based on a training set that we took from the internet from this Berkeley segmentation database. And so here you see the cross-validation. I mean, this is just one parameter, but it's quite robust. So you basically get the same parameter trained on 100 images and then validated on another 100 and then switching rows. If you look at the cost functional, so here you see the cost functional, this L2 squared fit. Here you see the corresponding peak signal to noise ratio. This is just to make the point that this really corresponds to maximizing this. This is plotted against the optimal parameter, alpha. And what you see is that, so the x is the optimal one, and it seems to be an optimum, minimum of this cost functional. Now, this is where things are actually quite surprising, because there was at some point we kind of believed that this at least is quasi-convex if you just look at optimizing for one parameter in this total variation regularization framework, but this is already non-convex. And this is not due to me. This is came out of a PhD thesis of Pan Liu, a PhD student of Irene Fonseca, where they used the result of this paper by Strong and Tony Chan, where for very simple, in 1D, for very simple input signals, they can explicitly compute what the solution is, okay? And in this case, if you do this, so the blue is the clean signal and the red is the solution of the variational regularization approach. And you plot against, again, for different values of alpha, the cost functional, you see that this is not at all convex, not even quasi-convex. It's just not convex. Okay, and this is just one parameter. And maybe just to say, you know, this is also quite hard, why it's quite hard to understand what these deep neural networks or whatever are doing, because they are so extremely non-convex, these problems, and then you even have 1,000 parameters. So let me actually, so we can do this for different types of TV regularization. Let me just go over this. The nice thing about this is, because you can optimize over different types of total variation regularization, you can play around and maybe evaluate them. And maybe evaluate them against each other by optimizing over these parameters. Okay, but this is extremely simple. So let me show you two extensions of this. One of them is by Tom Pock. And here we are in the finite dimensional setting, by the way. So here the idea is, let's forget about this TV type regularizers, and let's completely parameterize the regularizer in terms of two things. First of all, in terms of filters, KK, that I apply to U. And then I'm optimizing over the entries in these filters. I choose a particular size of these filters, and then I'm optimizing over the entries. And he's also optimizing over the type of nonlinearity, over the type of metric, if you wish, that should be applied to these linear operators applied to U, the row case, which he parametrizes in terms of radial basis functions. Okay, and then he optimizes over the parameters in this radial basis function expansion and over the parameters in these KKs. And then it's quite kind of interesting because it's still a bit, you know, it's still interpretable. Here on the left, you see the optimal filters that came out, the KKs, in this linear combination. And here you see the optimal nonlinearities. And I mean, first of all, okay, this is now not just one parameter or two or something like this, but these are 6,480 parameters. So it takes a long time to compute this, to be fair. But the type of filters that you get, and some of the first ones are kind of already going along the lines of total variation type regularization, maybe, or at least they show you some maybe finite differences, forward differences, or something like this that are applied to U. Do you know what I mean? Yeah? Black and white, so kind of take the difference. Okay. So the interesting thing was that although he didn't design that at all just for denoising, this is a very generic idea, he, at that time, 2 years ago, he was beating in a lot of cases, so these are his two results for different sizes of these filters, he was beating some of the very state-of-the-art denoising approaches with this idea. And then, now we are deviating from the variational framework, so why do we need to do this variational regularization? Actually, maybe we can deviate from that. And here the idea is, now, think of this as a gradient descent of an energy for denoising. You don't have a forward operator here. These are is the derivative of these regularizers that you have seen before, but now I'm optimizing over this just for a finite number of steps, and I change in every step the type of regularization that I use. So now those can also change in time. And now we are coming closer and closer to maybe something like what neural networks are doing, where in each layer you're doing something else, you're optimizing over what you want to do. And then he can again get very, very impressive results. And so now the last thing, and I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to show you one more thing, which is now based on the following. So this is joint work with Sebastian Lunz in Cambridge and Jonas and Ozan, who are at KTH. And it's very much based on this idea of using what Ozan calls learned iterative reconstruction. So now think of what I've shown you of Tom before. But now every gradient step of an iterative scheme, let's say, is given by a neural network. And it's not a completely black box neural network, but you're feeding this neural network not just with the last iteration, and I should really stop, but you're feeding it also with information about the forward operator. And this is here, this is the gradient of the discrepancy term, encoding the forward operator and the data. So I just show you one very, very quick thing, which is the idea of using this learned iterative reconstruction in connection with a classification problem. And so we are starting here with the following idea. We have given images from the MNIST database. We're looking at those, but we are not feeding those into the classification, but we are feeding their corresponding sinograms. And not the whole sinogram, but we are feeding only 5 angles and 25 lines. I mean, these images in MNIST that you have seen also yesterday in Andreas' talk, they're very small. They're just 28 by 28. So it's not that bad. And then you add some noise. And now the idea is you do a learned iterative reconstruction on them. You pre-train this. And then, based on these learned iterative reconstructed MNIST digits, you are classifying them. And here, we just used an off-the-shelf network to do this. But the really crucial idea, which made all the difference, was not just to do this sequentially, but to train them together. And this is not a nice thing. If you have this learned, if you're using this neural network idea, you can easily connect it with something like classification or something like this. And here the idea is that then you're training them together with a loss function with an optimality criterion that now evaluates both the reconstruction quality and the classification quality of these digits. So classification into 0 to 9. So just to give you an idea, these are filtered back projection reconstructions of these sinograms. So this is the type, this is really not MNIST anymore. This is sinograms of MNIST, noisy sinograms, undersampled noisy sinograms. And then if you would just use an off-the-shelf reconstruction, you get something like this. And now, if you look at this, can anyone tell me what the digits are? Okay, so just to tell you, if you would feed this filtered back projection into this off-the-shelf classifier, that is trained on these filtered back projection images, then it gives you the outcome of this classification is the probability for each of the classes. And in this case, it thinks it's an 8. Okay. If I now feed this into this connected task-based reconstruction, so connected iterative learned reconstruction and classification, then it thinks it's a 4. So now, what is somehow difficult is if you just have this, it's not clear what really the right solution is. If you connect it with a reconstruction, and you're also optimizing over this, you actually get something that might be a 4. And if you compared it with the ground truth, it is a 4. Okay? So let me finish. I'm very sorry for overrunning. But the whole idea is that I think there are various pluses and minuses to both approaches. As I said at the beginning, I mostly worked in variational modeling, and that's why also there's lots of green there. No, but these are really very important advantages. But there is also a red part here, which is a negative, which we very often realize. And this is the big green in the machine learning type approaches. So the hope is somehow to bring those two together. And I think you can read the conclusion here. And I should really stop, and I thank you for your attention.